Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are so pleased that you could join us this morning for this wonderful panel of scholars who are going to, we are quite sure they're going to astonish us with information about the suffrage movement and the 1913 suffrage march that we are all here and gathered to celebrate. So thank you so much. My name is Joan Wages. I'm president and CEO of the National Women's History Museum. We are so pleased to be sponsoring this event. The chair of our panel is Ann Lewis, who is a woman who has made history herself. You'll see her bio in the program that you received, and I won't go through all of it, but Ann was working on Senator Mikulski's first congressional campaign, so she helped make history in getting Senator Mikulski elected. It was Congresswoman Mikulski at the time. She has worked in President Clinton's White House, where she co-chaired the Commission on Celebrating Women's History, and she's also worked as as an advisor for the presidential and Senate campaigns for Senator Clinton, and now, of course, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. So we are absolutely thrilled to have Ann Lewis chairing this panel, and we are sure that you will just be amazed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan, for that introduction. Thanks to you and to all the leaders of the National Women's History Museum for your commitment to bringing women's history to life. We're about to hear from 5 distinguished scholars. You have more information about them in your lovely programs. So I'm going to ask you to pay attention to the programs as you go so I can give very short introductions. We want to use our time to hear from our panelists, and then we want to hear from you. So we've asked our timekeeper, Janae down there is our timekeeper, and she is going to literally wave the red flag when time is up, and if that doesn't quite work, Janae and I are going to wave our flags to get your attention. But we do want, again, to have some questions. We want to hear from you. We're here today to learn more about history and to celebrate democracy. The women's suffrage movement achieved the largest single expansion of American democracy on any single day. Now, not perfectly. Yes, worth applauding. Wasn't perfect. That required the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and now it seems we may have to fight for the Voting Rights Act again. But the victory of the suffrage movement established in the Constitution of the United States that women and men deserve that most basic right of citizenship, the right to vote. And that didn't come easily. At that very first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, the audience agreed with every resolution except one, the right to vote. That was seen by some as too radical. It would make us look ridiculous. But Frederick Douglass, that brilliant advocate for freedom, stood with Elizabeth Cady Stanton to argue that the franchise, the power to choose our rulers, to make our laws, the franchise was fundamental. It was the right by which all others could be sustained. Well, if the idea of women voting ever seemed ridiculous, nobody's laughing anymore. In November 2012, women cast the majority of votes, and women's votes were the winning margin for President Obama. Without the 19th Amendment, we would have had a very different outcome. So how did we get here? In 3 generations, how did a small group of women and an even smaller group of men win their fight? Think about it. When they began, women had almost no legal rights. They had little or no money to try to win them, and a whole lot of people who thought the idea was ridiculous. The suffrage pioneers went door to door with petitions, asking for signatures. They rode to small towns in horse-drawn wagons, climbed the steps of tenement buildings, and sold home-baked goods in suffrage bazaars. Women who had been taught that ladies did not speak in public, gave speeches on street corners, and learned to deal with hecklers. They captured public attention with store window lectures, music hall fundraisers, and parades. And that brings us to our discussion today, the 100th anniversary of the 1913 parade that brought the cause of women's suffrage to the front of the nation's newspapers and our national agenda. Our first speaker is Bob Cooney, an award-winning editor and writer and author of the landmark book, Winning the Vote, The Triumph of the American Suffrage Movement. Bob, it's all yours.
Good morning and welcome. And thank you, Anne, and thank you to the National Women's History Museum for sponsoring this wonderful panel. I wanted to open the day with an image of the great suffrage leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton to represent our theme of 3 generations. Both her daughter and her granddaughter marched in the 1913 parade, and her descendants will march again tomorrow. Today we celebrate the centennial of the first great parade in the Capitol for women's political freedom. Too often, women's accomplishments in American history have been downplayed or ignored, like the women's suffrage movement I'm about to briefly summarize. So it's a real pleasure to be here to celebrate this historic anniversary today. I have to move quickly, but I'll be showing a longer and slower version of this slideshow at the AAUW this afternoon. As you all know, the goal of this early civil rights movement was simple: equal citizenship, including the right to vote for women. It took suffragists over 72 years of work to reach their goal, which is now enshrined in the 19th Amendment to our Constitution. Many women in the early 19th century were well aware of their lack of citizenship. The roots of the women's suffrage movement reach all the way back to the abolition movement. In the 1830s, white women and black women met together to oppose slavery, and they learned firsthand about nonviolent organizing and about violent resistance. In 1848, supporters gathered in Seneca Falls for the first of many organized meetings for the equal rights for women. The first generation of suffrage leaders rose up over the next decades. They met together, spoke widely, petitioned, published, lobbied, and organized for women's rights. After the Civil War, suffragists first tried to get a constitutional amendment passed by Congress. Here they're shown flocking for freedom here in the Capitol in 1878. However, women found little support in Congress, the White House, or the Supreme Court. Therefore, the only alternative suffragists saw was to try to win the vote state by state, which is what they did over the next 40 years. During this time, a new generation of leaders rose up. Suffragists carried out 18 grueling state electoral campaigns, but by 1908, there were only 4 states where women could vote equally with men. Susan B. Anthony kept up the demand for a constitutional amendment, spending part of each year lobbying congressmen. It was said that they knew it was spring when Susan B. Anthony appeared in a red shawl on the steps of the Capitol, like on this stamp. However, when she ended her annual lobbying efforts in 1891, there ceased to be progress on the federal amendment. Suffragists were able to win 5 more states before 1913, and that's where the emphasis remained until this parade. It was during this final period that a new generation of women grew up. These women bolstered the aging state and national bodies and forged the final drive to victory. But from the beginning, there were always divisions within the movement that created ongoing tension. The politically divided nation reflected the divisions among suffragists. Not only did some women not want suffrage, but some suffragists didn't want a federal amendment. Racial, class, and geographical differences and serious divisions over strategy were always a part of this movement, as they have long been in male politics. This was the context for the 1913 parade in Washington. Its purpose was to focus attention back on the federal amendment, which was really the only way all women would ever get the vote, given the complexities of the different state constitutions. The parade was organized, as you know, by the newly revived Congressional Committee of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the one and only national group. But few suffragists or politicians thought a women's suffrage amendment was possible or urgent enough to focus on. After Susan B. Anthony's death, that role was taken on by Alice Paul, who gave the drive a new sense of urgency and momentum. She was 28. Her first major effort in the US was this groundbreaking parade in the nation's capital. And the point I really want to make today is how intentionally beautiful and striking it was. Witnesses testified to the grandeur, the grace, and appeal of the remarkable procession, the unfolding spectacle of colors, costumed marchers, bands, floats, and women on horseback was unlike anything they had ever seen. The newspapers at the time were effusive, and the images that survive only hint at this remarkable experience. The procession featured 7 sections, each with its own theme about women's rights. There was music throughout, with bands playing and heralds sounding their trumpets as a procession passed by. Suffragists publicized the parade widely, and the result was that vast crowds filled Pennsylvania Avenue by noon. The parade began about 3:20 in the afternoon, led by mounted heralds and the amendment float on the right, which announced, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of the country." Ushers in blue robes with gold sashes led the way for President Anna Howard Shaw and members of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. There was color everywhere, from the red, white, and blue bunting on the buildings to the thousands of yellow suffrage sashes, pennants, badges, and ribbons on the marchers. Each contingent wore coordinated colors, like this one from the Montgomery County Historical Society in Maryland, creating a spectacular river of rainbow colors as the thousands of women marched by. International President Carrie Chapman Catt led the parade's first section, which was dedicated to the worldwide movement for women's suffrage. Floats and marchers in native dress emphasized that women had already won the vote in other countries. Other floats highlighted countries where women are working for suffrage and women of the Bible lands. The section, "Man and Woman Make the State, Man Alone Rules the State," featured 9 horse-drawn floats showing women and men working together in all aspects of life except government. The first float in the field was followed by women farmers dressed in brown. Then came In the Home, followed by a delegation of costumed homemakers. Uniformed nurses marched after the float in public service, on which a nurse was shown with a soldier. There were also colorful ranks of college women, women lawyers, doctors, pharmacists, and wage earners, showing that women were no longer defined just by the home. And after them, wearing light to dark shades of blue, women in government service, businesswomen, teachers, and others swept by, personifying the appeal of business and the professions. They were followed by writers, artists, and musicians in 3 shades of rose. Congressmen and members of the major political parties followed a section of ununiformed women, which included late-arriving businesswomen, club women, women clergy, and others. After them came the appeal of the states, which included this banner float, followed by delegations from the 9 equal suffrage states and 6 golden chariots. The last section featured marchers from states working for equal suffrage, like Massachusetts. A final banner carried Abraham Lincoln's words, "No country can exist, half slave and half free." It was an extraordinary demonstration for women's rights. However, after the parade had gone only a few blocks on Pennsylvania Avenue, the huge crowd pressed in and blocked its progress. Efforts to open a path were fitful, and in some places the unrestrained mob squeezed the marchers to a narrow passage at best. Some of the surrounded women were harassed and assaulted. Police were overwhelmed and often unsympathetic. Mounted federal troops on the right had to be called out, and they roughly drove the crowds back so the parade could continue. The marchers finally prevailed, but what should have been taken 45 minutes had taken more than 3 intense and frightening hours. But what could have been just another story became a national sensation. There was also an extraordinary allegorical tableau which coincided with the procession, but I haven't had time to describe it here. This parade is important because it marked both the emergence of Alice Paul as a suffrage leader and the serious resumption of work on the federal amendment. Later, Paul separated from the National Association and distanced herself from Carrie Chapman Catt, who disagreed with her on strategy. 2 years after the parade, however, Catt recognized that the time for a suffrage amendment had finally come. She mobilized the National Association's network of state associations to win congressional support and prepare for the eventual ratification drive. But first, she focused on winning key state contests like New York and winning presidential suffrage, where women could vote for president in states where the legislature could decide that. Alice Paul unleashed an unprecedented set of imaginative, nonviolent direct actions that demanded elected representatives pass the amendment. Among the most controversial was her strategy of asking the women in the equal suffrage states who could vote to boycott all Democratic candidates to protest their party's obstruction of the amendment. Carrie Catt cultivated President Wilson's support and vigorously opposed the strategy of holding the party in power responsible. She also disagreed with picketing the White House in 1917, another of Alice Paul's innovations. By 1919, suffragists' tangible political victories meant that women could vote for the next president in 15 equal suffrage states, plus 15 states, regardless of the federal amendment. Bowing to this inescapable reality and the constant pressure, Congress finally passed the federal amendment. I think I ran out of slides, but anyway. Suffragists across the country then dedicated themselves to getting the necessary 36 states to ratify it so women could vote in the 1920 election. And as we know, they were successful. Over 20 million women finally took their rightful place in American history, and our country became a more complete democracy. Which brings us back to the seminal action that relaunched the final drive for the 19th Amendment. Happy anniversary to the brave women who marched here 100 years ago and who finally won the vote for women. Thank you.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. Thank you for the history. Thank you for those wonderful pictures, many of which I assume we could also find in your book.
Yes.
And thank you for showing us once again why we are here today and celebrating the parade. For our next speaker, Dr. Kitty Sklar had hoped to be with us. Unfortunately, she has had a fall and cannot travel, but she is about to be ably represented by Dr. Kristen Gwynn Becker, who is a scholar recently here at GW, I believe, and the founder of an organization with a wonderful title, History IT. Dr. Becker.
Thank you. I'm going to read Kitty's paper as it was given to me, so any references to I in the first person is me channeling the author. Local and national in the 1913 suffrage march in Washington, D.C. Let's view the 1913 march through the eyes of Elizabeth Freeman, shown here with her suffrage wagon on her way to the march from New York City, where she was working with the Women's Suffrage Party. Here she is speaking in D.C., perhaps on the day of the march. Freeman's perspective helps us see two important aspects of the march and its place in the larger suffrage movement: its fundamentally local character, its effort to forge national goals on the basis of its local strength. Historians have viewed the march as a moment when the movement's national efforts gained traction and led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Yet a closer look at the march and its place in the suffrage movement reminds us of the importance of the local structures that shaped the march and the national goals it promoted. This view of the march draws from two document projects about Elizabeth Freeman that you can find in the online journal that is Kitty co-edit, Women in Social Movements in the United States. Today, we'll combine a few documents drawn from an Elizabeth Freeman project with others about the social movement, the suffrage movement more generally. Like Alice Paul, Elizabeth Freeman was an American who first joined the suffrage movement in England, an accomplished speaker at international venues in England, Scotland, Germany, and Holland, In London in 1911, she participated in militant civil disobedience, breaking windows and getting arrested during marches on Parliament and Downing Street. Later that year, as this brochure explains, she returned to America to work with the Women's Suffrage Party of New York. Freeman's work in New York emphasized national issues as depicted on her suffrage wagon in DC. Child labor, you can see it, child labor, pure food, school sanitation, white slavery, clean streets, and wages. And with a phalanx of suffrage newsgirls, she distributed publications by the National Suffrage Organization, especially the Women's Journal. So from Freeman's perspective, the local and the national were complementary, not mutually exclusive. But by living and working in the local New York movement, Freeman exemplified the overwhelming power of local and state currents within the national movement. This Wikipedia map of women's suffrage before the 19th Amendment helps us understand those currents. Between 1869 and 1920, the power of local suffrage movements generated different forms of suffrage in different locations, reflecting the capacities and achievements of local movements and their obstacles and opportunities. Full suffrage was enacted in many Western states, though we need to remember that race discrimination in the Pacific Rim states denied citizen rights to all Asian-born women and men. Partial suffrage, including presidential voting rights, was enacted in many Midwestern states. In Texas, white women could vote in primary elections, which were open to whites only. No women's suffrage existed in the South, with the exception of Georgia, where women could vote in some municipal elections. Those maroon states demonstrate the resistance to women's suffrage in the heart of the former Confederacy, where women's suffrage threatened the stability of laws that blocked the votes of black men. This diversity of women's suffrage rights arose from more than 2 generations of phenomenal local activism. 480 campaigns in state legislatures, 277 campaigns in state party conventions. Pale by comparison, but nevertheless an integral part of the suffrage movement, were the 20 congressional campaigns in the 40 years between 1880 and 1920, when national leaders like Susan B. Anthony testified before Congress to promote an amendment to the Constitution. National leaders also met with congressmen in their congressional offices and in hotel lobbies, launching lobbying as a political activity. But overwhelmingly, these national campaigns were waged in congressmen's home districts, where women drew more effectively on their local power, social, political, and economic. That local power was nowhere more evident than in New York City, where this impressive march occurred in 1912. 3 aspects of this image seem especially important: the well-organized ranks of marchers, the throngs of onlookers, and, just as important, the local infrastructure of police protection that separated marchers from onlookers. Elizabeth Freeman helped organize that march, which drew on the deep pockets of Alva Belmont, a powerful figure in New York's elite, who began to fund the city's suffrage marches in 1909 and became the chief funder of Alice Paul's efforts in DC in 1913. What happened when those local suffrage forces came to Washington in 1913? Of course, much of the Washington March successfully represented the diversity and strength of the women's suffrage movement throughout the United States. But, reflecting the local conditions of the suffrage movement in Washington, the marchers were inadequately protected by police and overwhelmed by onlookers. The march ground to a halt. Freeman's wagon may be visible here, among others. Wherever she was at this moment, she surely was thinking, where is the local infrastructure? Historians have described the breakdown of the march, but they haven't placed it in the larger context of the movement's local structures. If New York City was among the strongest local suffrage communities, Washington was among its weakest. Politically, the city's weak suffrage movement reflected the fact that its citizens could not vote, even for local officials. This highlights the importance of the Howard University students who promoted the march as a local action despite their local disenfranchisement. The great majority of African American women still lived in the South, and Black women knew that the only way those women would be enfranchised was through a federal amendment. Ida B. Wells and other Black women suffragists joined the march, but culturally, Washington resembled a southern city with Jim Crow restrictions on the rights of African Americans. Like the anti-suffrage South, its relationship to women's suffrage was complicated by the city's historic ties with Southern racism. And this helps us understand why the issue of Black women's participation loomed so large in the planning and execution of the march. Organizationally, the march planners received relatively little help from the national organization, which viewed the passage of the federal amendment as a finish to the fight that they had already succeeded in most states. Between 1890 and 1909, the national headquarters of NASA shifted from New York City to Philadelphia to Cleveland and back to New York as the organization sought to serve its local constituents. In November of 1913, the membership emphatically rejected a proposal to move to DC, insisting that the organization's chief purpose was to aid local suffrage campaigns. NASA's national headquarters moved to DC in 1917 when the constitutional amendment seemed the only way that suffrage would be gained in the recalcitrant states. What new light does this view of the march shed on Alice Paul and those who joined her in picketing the White House after 1913? It helps us see them as a local suffrage movement. While the new leadership of Maud Wood Park coordinated NASA's national pressures on congressmen to support the suffrage amendment, Paul and her cohorts concentrated on the city's highest official. Beginning in 1913, Elva Belmont's Deep Pockets funded Paul's movement, as well as that in New York City. And after 1920, Belmont was the chief and almost exclusive funder of the National Women's Party. With that support assured, Paul did not need to build a wider network, and she was not accountable to a larger organization. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Freeman worked on the suffrage movement in Chicago and elsewhere, though not in DC. So while the 1913 march definitely contributed to the adoption of the 19th Amendment, perhaps the best way to understand it is as an excellent example of that difficult American truism: all politics is local.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Please tell Kitty Sklar that we really appreciate her being thoughtful and doing her presentation so much ahead of time, unlike some of us, that you were able to give it, and we really look forward to talking to you further.
Can we maybe ask people if they're hearing well from these mics?
Oh, I'm sorry. If you are not hearing, this may be self-defeating, but if you are not hearing well, can you raise your hand?
You're not hearing well.
All right. Then we'll assume that everyone is, but remember, you can come closer and we'll yell if necessary. Now we're going to hear from Mary Walton. Mary has been a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer and other publications, and she's the author of A Woman's Crusade, Alice Paul and the Battle for the Ballot. Mary.
Thank you very much. So nice to see you this morning. The remarkable parade, whose centennial we are commemorating this weekend, was the inspiration of Alice Paul, a young Quaker from New Jersey. She was the leader of the militant wing of the women's suffrage movement and the founder of the National Women's Party. 100 years ago, women could vote in only 9 states, all out in the thinly populated West. In none of the 13 American colonies, the birthplace of American democracy, could women cast ballots. Alice Paul orchestrated the 1913 parade to launch a drive for a federal amendment that would give women the country over the right to vote. The battle she waged was the quintessential story of one person against the odds. It was David against Goliath. It was Rocky. Alice took on the President of the United States, the US Congress, essentially the entire US government. But the parade also launched Alice Paul. 7 years later, when the amendment was signed into law, Alice was the most publicized suffragist in the country, possibly the best known. She was born in 1885 to a strict Quaker family, attended Quaker schools, including Swarthmore College, tried social work for a year. It didn't work out for her. She said it didn't change things. Earned a master's degree in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and went to England to continue her studies. It was here that she enlisted in the militant suffrage movement, led by this woman, Emmeline Pankhurst, who is shown here under arrest, as she so often was. In that year, in 1909, Alice was arrested 7 times, went to jail 3 times. The tactic of the day, the women, was to go on hunger strikes. And when they did that, the authorities force-fed them. This happened to Alice. Not a pretty picture. So, when she returned to the United States, we might say she had kind of a rep. American suffragists, fairly conservative lot, were wary of this newcomer to the suffrage scene. Nevertheless, Alice was able to persuade the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, to revive a campaign for the federal amendment. The amendment was not new. It was voted on in the Senate in 1897. It was defeated, never debated again. Because at that time, American suffragists were focused on state campaigns, on winning the battle state by state. The federal amendment would come last. Suffrage as a goal was formally articulated by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the Declaration of Sentiments, 1848 in Seneca Falls. It is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. This was the most controversial plank in a controversial declaration. Depend on it, Stanton would later write. This is the point to attack. She called it the stronghold of the fortress, the one woman will find most difficult to take, the one man will most reluctantly give up. And so it was. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony worked for the vote for the next 50 years. In 1906, when Anthony died, only 4 states had given women full suffrage. Alice Paul thought a federal amendment offered a shortcut. But she was not going to get a lot of help out of the suffrage establishment. When NAWSA gave her the assignment to go to Washington to head its congressional committee, she was told she must raise her own money, she must recruit her own supporters. And NASA, well, she could use their letterhead. So she arrives in Washington, end of 1912. She rents a room in a boarding house catered to Quakers, and this office space on F Street, which will be her headquarters. She immediately goes to work on the parade. Parade will be on March 4th, or March 3rd, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration on March 4th, and it will take place on Pennsylvania Avenue. She is joined by Lucy Burns, whom she had met in England in the suffrage movement, and they would work closely together for the next 5 years. Lucy had this big mop of red hair, which was said to match her fiery temperament. The parade would not only be the first suffrage parade in Washington, it would be the first organized social protest parade, and this was important. In 1894, Joseph Coxey had led some 400 unemployed men up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol in a demonstration for jobs. It did not go well for him. He was arrested for trespassing on the Capitol lawn and never even got to make a speech. Alice's parade would be just a little different. 24 horse-drawn floats, 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds with trumpets, and at least 5,000 women, though possibly as many as 8,000, so many in any case that the organizers lost count. It would also incorporate a pageant. Pageants were all the rage in those days, and this pageant on the Treasury steps featured 100 women and children. Here's the first float, the Great Demand float. And I call your attention to the word demand. Demand was not something that women did in those days. They asked politely, they begged, they pleaded. They did not demand. Demand was an incendiary word, and Alice was putting Wilson on notice that the women wanted action. But before she can have her parade, Alice needs a permit. The gentleman on the right, the superintendent of police, William Sylvester, turns her down. He's worried about the route, Pennsylvania Avenue, very close to the Bowery district. Wilson's inauguration, Wilson is the first Southern president since the Civil War, expected to draw a lot of Southerners who want to celebrate the rise of one of their own. They're going to be a rowdy bunch. Sylvester calls them rough scuff. They will be drinking, so he doesn't like the route. He suggests that perhaps they could have the parade on March 5th, the day after the inauguration. Well, Alice doesn't think much of that idea. Well, what about 16th Street, a beautiful street? No, she doesn't like that idea either. She must have the avenue. The avenue is where the men march. So she recruits wives of prominent people in Washington, congressmen, military men, professionals, and she goes to the press. She works the phone. And I have to tell you, myself as a lifelong journalist, Alice was a public relations genius. She gets her way, Sylvester caves in. We have seen what happened to the parade. Now, you would think that Alice would be dismayed by what had happened to her beautiful procession, as she called it. But no, she sees that this, on the front pages of newspapers across America, is a better story than her parade would have been. And she's especially delighted by the failure of the police to keep order. She says, she writes a supporter, this mistreatment by the police was probably the best thing that could ever have happened to us, as it aroused a great deal of public indignation and sympathy. She is convinced that suffrage is right around the corner, but no, she is wrong. There will be more parades, demonstrations, petitions, lobbying, even election campaigns. In 1917, she will lead the first picket line ever to the White House, to the gates of the White House. Well, it's World War I. The women are regarded as traitors picketing a sitting president. They are arrested. Riots break out. They go to jail. They go on hunger strikes. They are force-fed, including Alice. And when at last the amendment passes, there still remains an arduous 14-month ratification campaign. But at last it does pass. It is signed into law on August 26, 1920, in time for women to vote in the November election. Alice was far from done fighting for female equality. She would go on to write the ERA and fight for it all her long life. She died in 1977 at the age of 92. I leave you with the words of Hazel Hunkins Hallinan, one of her most loyal supporters. She had the secret of all great leaders. Within her spirit was a flame, forcing her to make right what she thought to be wrong to her sex, and she communicated this in full strength to others. After a talk with Alice Paul about what had to be done, one left her presence twice one's size and ready to do anything for a cause that she made you feel so deeply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. And now we're going to hear another perspective on Alice Paul from Dr. Jill Zahniser. Did I do it right?
You did.
Oh, good. Thank you. I've been practicing. Dr. Jill Zahniser, who works as a historian, master teacher at the American Institute for History Education, and is co-author of a new biography of Alice Paul to be published this year.
Thank you, Ann. Can everyone hear me? No. Okay. Can everyone hear me now? How's that? Okay, good. The working title of my book, which is forthcoming from Oxford towards the end of this year, early next year, is Alice Paul, The Making of a Political Leader. It could also be called Becoming Alice Paul, because the book is the first to treat Alice Paul's early life and examine how she got from a sheltered Quaker upbringing in Moorestown, New Jersey, or I know my friend Barbara Irvine's going to correct me here, outside of Moorestown, New Jersey, in Mount Laurel Township, New Jersey, how she got from a Quaker childhood to being the leader of the National Woman's Party. I give particular attention to the Quaker, to her Quaker upbringing, and also how she moved through the higher education system, and I think gained her political consciousness with her knowledge of how fragile women's acceptance was within women's higher education. And this is before she met up with the Pankhursts. But it's interesting that when I was doing my chapter on the parade that we're talking about today, I was rather astonished to begin looking at evidence which indicated that our existing historical understanding of the parade is actually not accurate. Our historical understanding right now that's recorded in most, though not all accounts, is that African American women marched in the 1913 procession, but they marched in a special section at the back of the parade. In other words, they were segregated, with the sole exception of Ida B. Wells, who managed to finagle herself into the Illinois delegation. That story is largely accurate. Many accounts also blame Alice Paul for attempting to exclude black women from the parade. I think that the historical record is in fact more positive, gave a more positive outcome both to black and to white women than our existing understanding, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. Initially, when Alice Paul was queried about whether black women would be accepted into the parade, she said yes. In fact, she had already, and this is early in January 1913, talked to Mary Church Terrell, who was perhaps the most well-known, most prominent black leader in Washington, D.C. And there were many reasons why African American women wanted to participate in the parade, and some of which has been picked up in Professor Sklar's presentation. But this is the 50th anniversary also in 1913 of the Emancipation Proclamation. So that was one reason they were interested in marching. Black women had been moving into higher education along with white women, and they had been organizing organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, which was led by Terrell. They had been organizing for the last 20, 30 years. And so they had many of the same hopes and dreams as people like Alice Paul, who had gone through the higher education system as well. And as Professor Sklar's presentation indicated, black women thought that a federal amendment was their best hope to become enfranchised themselves. They had also been fighting, not only in Washington, D.C., but really throughout the country, but particularly in the South, against an encroaching number of Jim Crow laws. In Washington, D.C., they had been recently protesting against an attempt to segregate trolley cars, for example. So this became an attempt for them to push back the colored line, if only a little bit. It's also important to recognize that in Washington was published The Crisis, the NWHM journal that was edited at the time by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was very vocal himself in support of the parade and in support of black women marching. So initially, Alice Paul was accepting of black women's participation in the parade. When she learned, however, that one woman, actually a white woman supportive of black women's participation, wanted to contact the Woman's Journal, the National Suffrage Journal, and wanted Alice Stone Blackwell, the editor of that journal, to publicize the fact that black women would be welcome. Alice Paul feared that the image of black women at the time, the stereotype of black women, I should say, would overwhelm the very beautiful, very dignified, very graceful, very bourgeois, middle class image of the parade that she wanted to put forward. She talked with Blackwell, whose mother, of course, Lucy Stone, was very supportive of when there was a split in the earlier suffrage movement between those women who wanted race and sex both to be in the 15th Amendment and those women who were supportive of black men being enfranchised first. Lucy Stone was on the side of the quote-unquote Negroes' Hour. So she had a pedigree very much in support of black rights. In talking with officials at NASA also, we had really three people, Alice Paul, Blackwell, and the official at NASA, Mary Ware Dennett, who were actually very supportive of black women marching in the parade, but at the same time very concerned that the image of the parade would be compromised by the presence of too many black women. And while it's easy for us to call this racism from the distance of 100 years, we have to note also that these were very real fears that they were dealing with. Most people had the stereotype in their minds of black women that they were not particularly respectable. The suffrage movement had worked a long time to become respectable as a movement. And so, along with all of the very conventional feminine images that Alice Paul was trying to insert in the parade, this had consequences that they were not willing to accept. I think the mistake they made at this point, and this goes back to something that those of you that were here there the other night at the panel at the press club, Rosalind Terborg Penn was talking about Susan B. Anthony and how she had agreements with black women for some events that they wouldn't appear or they wouldn't appear in large numbers. And that she talked with them about this and they understood that their image might compromise what was going on at the event. So what Anthony did is keep up the conversation with black women. And this is a mistake, I think, that was made in this early discussion at the parade, that Alice Paul, Alice Stone Blackwell, and Mary Ware Dennett did not bring black women in at this point and come up with an acceptable agreement for everyone. I think this is the mistake they made, and I think it reflects the fact of Alice Paul's inexperience at this point in the national suffrage movement. So I think really that's the mistake that was made. And as I mentioned, Susan B. Anthony had not made that mistake. So there were lots of reasons why black women wanted to march, but Alice Paul really viewed black women in the march in much the same way, not so much from a racial perspective, but this idea of damaging the image that she wanted to plant in the national, she wanted to move into national prominence. Interestingly, she regarded the Pilgrims, whom Kristen was talking about, in much the same way. The Pilgrims were marching in they're making a pilgrimage, marching in their cheerless black cloaks from New York City to Washington, D.C., trudging along on foot. And initially, Alice Paul was very supportive of the Pilgrims, kind of unconventional march in support of suffrage. When they decided to include men in their group, so that you would have a mixed-sex group of people marching along, staying, not exactly communally, but staying along the way in different homes, then she thought, she wrote the organizer of the Pilgrims, and I'm slipping on her name now, Rosalie Jones, and said that she thought the inclusion of men seemed like it turned in the Pilgrims Crusade into a lark rather than a serious political crusade. She was concerned that the image of the women with the Pilgrims would not be respectable if they were marching with men. So there's much of the same concern about damaging the image that she was trying to create for the suffrage movement. So there were many rumors, a lot of conflicting rumors that are reported in the press and that kind of circulate. At the same time, black women were communicating with each other privately to encourage each other to march in the parade. So there was this sort of underground network of black women that was saying, yes, let's march, yes, let's march. Lots of conflicting rumors, and one which emerged right before the parade saying that black women were going to be barred. These were rumors. These were not the case. And Alice Paul consistently accepted invitations that she received from Howard University and others to march in the parade. She just didn't want them to be terribly publicized. The end result was, we know for Ida B. Wells that she slipped into the Illinois delegation. There was some confusion in the Illinois delegation initially, and one of the local women in the parade, among the parade organizers, indicated that they wanted a segregated Illinois delegation. I haven't been able to trace back where that order came from, but it is later heavily disputed in private communication between Alice Paul and W.E.B. Du Bois. Ultimately, all of the other women besides Ida B. Wells marched where they wanted to march. And I'll read you what W.E.B. Du Bois said in the crisis in April. He notes the confusion, the conflicting rumors, and finally he says, eventually the colored women marched according to their state and occupation without let or hindrance. They marched where they wanted to march, in other words. The Howard women marched with the college women. There were several women who marched with their own state delegations. Ultimately, about 50 women marched where they wanted to march in the suffrage parade. So it was really a quiet triumph for black women. And my last note is from Carrie Clifford, who reported where all of the different women marched in the crisis, in the same crisis that of the W.E.B. Du Bois quote. And she notes, the black women received no worse treatment from bystanders than was accorded white women. So they weren't treated well, but neither were the white women. So in that sense, it was a quiet triumph. They were treated in an equal way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Given us a lot to think about and wonder about in that presentation. And we now go to Dr. Erin Chapman, a historian of American race politics, gender politics, and African American cultural expression. And her next project is Fighting the World, African American Women and the Gender Politics of Racial Advancement. Erin?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this engaging panel. And I thank the panel organizers for their hard work in conceiving and staging this event. I was just saying, thank you for coming. And thank you for organizing the event to the panel organizers. Can you hear me now? Great. Okay. I want to talk about and think about black women's suffrage and citizenship this afternoon. And think about, why did black women support women's suffrage? What were the rationales and praxes black women developed as they advocated for suffrage? And what social and political pressures did they face as they practiced those politics? What is at stake in suffrage and citizenship for black women? As we consider 3 generations fighting the vote, I want to look back at the earliest generation first and consider the words and reasoning of Sojourner Truth. I'll then go on to discuss Ida B. Wells Barnett's suffrage activism in that March 1913 parade and beyond. Sojourner Truth was born a slave named Isabella in upstate New York in about 1797. Because New York was originally settled by Dutch colonists, Isabella's first language was Dutch, and she spoke English with a Dutch accent rather than the stereotypical black Southern dialect so often attributed to her. Nevertheless, she experienced the hallmarks we associate with slavery: backbreaking work without remittance, the exploitation of her productive and reproductive capabilities, sale from one owner to another, both she from her parents and her children from herself, with its resultant fracturing of her family, the dehumanizations and dispossessions of white supremacist patriarchy in her time. She was emancipated by New York state law in July 1827. In 1843, prompted by religious rebirth and personal self-determination, Isabella renamed herself Sojourner Truth. Her new name symbolized her quest. She would go sojourning after religious, moral, and political truths. Sojourner Truth was thereafter an itinerant Pentecostal preacher, a singer, and an advocate of abolition, women's suffrage, and black women's rights. In 1867, Truth attended a national conference of the Equal Rights Association. This group was an outgrowth of the established black and white abolitionist networks that sought to secure emancipation and black citizenship by ensuring the freed people's access to the vote, and also sought to extend the potential social revolution of emancipation by attaining women's suffrage. But by 1867, the organization had already broken down into fractions. One prioritizing the expansion of male suffrage to include black men, and the other advocating votes for women. Those, like the eminent black abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who supported women's suffrage but prioritized black men's suffrage, argued that black men urgently needed the vote as a weapon to defend themselves against the rising tide of anti-black violence in the nation. He argued that black women would be represented and protected by black men's citizenship and suffrage according to the established patriarchal model. On the other hand, those such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who prioritized women's suffrage first, argued that women such as themselves should have the vote before black men due to their intelligence, which is also about respectability, that respectability that Jill was discussing. This intelligence which black men presumably lacked. They developed a rhetoric and rationale highlighting literacy, education, and morality as standards for citizenship and suffrage. Sojourner Truth pointed out the problems for black women with both positions. In her speech at the 1867 meeting, she referenced the majority of colored women who go out washing, which is about as high as a colored woman gets. As a newly freed slave, Sojourner Truth had worked as a washerwoman and a cleaner on the lowest rung of the wage economy. Thus, she stood on her own ground, that of the newly freed black working woman, and constructed her women's suffrage arguments from there. Truth admonished the men at the Equal Rights Association conference. "You've been having our rights so long," she said, "that you think, like a slaveholder, that you own us." The our and the us Sojourner Truth represented in her 1867 speech was not all women and not all black people. She characterized herself as one of the few going about to speak for the rights of the colored woman. She spoke for the black women who needed the protection of their own citizenship rights to contract their own labor, claim their own money, and protect their own children. She emphasized that black women could not rely on black men's access to patriarchal citizenship to protect them and provide for them. Since she had seen black men ask for black women's money, I'm quoting her, and take it all, and then scold because there is no food on the table, she considered black patriarchy potentially exploitative of black women. If colored men get their rights, she said, and not colored women get theirs, there will be a bad time about it. Black women needed to have and hold their citizenship rights, their names, their labor, their reproduction, their votes for themselves. Speaking of her experience harvesting and binding grain, for which she was paid half as much as men doing the same work, Sojourner proclaimed, "We do as much, we eat as much, we want as much. And what we want is a little money. Money of black women's own, secured by their independent rights. Truth's claims to suffrage and citizenship were not based on intelligence, literacy, or morality. Money, work, and need. That's why suffrage was important for black women in Sojourner Truth's argument. Truth sought to craft a suffrage movement that would not demand black women choose between their blackness and their womanhood, as if they could make such a choice, but that would work to eliminate racism and sexism, that would endeavor to dismantle the system of white supremacist patriarchy built on the denial of citizenship to women like her. Sojourner Truth's vision, however, was not ultimately upheld. Women's suffrage was not built on as a praxis to challenge both white supremacy and patriarchy. We can see some of the consequences for this for the subsequent generations as we consider Ida B. Wells Barnett's experience at the 1913 suffrage march. Background on Ida. Ida B. Wells Barnett was born a slave in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. She was the eldest of 8 children, and at the age of 16, she was orphaned and assumed responsibility for all of her sisters and brothers. She supported herself and her siblings by working as a teacher in Mississippi and in Memphis, Tennessee. However, her dream was to write professionally. She tried fiction, but gained greater success through journalism. As a journalist, newspaper publisher, pamphleteer, and speaker, Ida B. Wells became famous, infamous really, for her fearless and uncompromising analysis of lynching, not as punishment for black men's rape of white women, but as a form of terrorism white supremacists perpetrated on black men, women, and children in order to maintain their political and economic subordination. After threats on her life effectively exiled her from her home in Memphis, Wells conducted an international speaking tour, drumming up support for anti-lynching and investigating new lynchings as they continued to occur across the United States. As of her marriage to attorney Ferdinand Barnett, Jr. in 1895, Wells changed her name to Wells Barnett and made Chicago her home base. She continued her activism through anti-lynching, racial advancement, women's rights, and workers' rights. She helped to found the National Association of Colored Women and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She supported the first National Black Union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and also defied the Military Intelligence Service in her support for Marcus Garvey and his Black nationalist Universal Negro Improvement Association. In Chicago, she founded a settlement house called the Negro Fellowship League and the city's first black women's suffrage organization, the Alpha Suffrage Club. Wells Barnett founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in January 1913 as a nonpartisan means for black women to participate in the reinvigorated effort to extend women's suffrage in Illinois and to block the segregationist initiatives the newly elected Democratic governor and state legislators were launching. The new organization promptly set about raising money to support Wells Barnett's trip to Washington, D.C. to join the Women's Suffrage Parade as a member of the Illinois delegation. In Washington, on the morning of the event, as Wells Barnett and the rest of the Illinois women practiced their parade formation, the head of the delegation, Grace Trout, rushed in to inform them that she had been directed by the national event organizers, and she referenced the leaders of the march, not Alice Hall, but Elizabeth Stone Blackwell. She said that she had been instructed to keep the Illinois delegation entirely white. Wells Barnett was to be denied the opportunity to represent her state and relegated to some colored section, not fully identified, of the parade. The delegation discussed the matter. They debated back and forth, but in the end, Trout insisted that if the National Association has decided it is unwise to include the colored women, we should abide by its decision. The humiliation of being excluded pained and angered Wells Barnett. Her strong emotion resulted in trembling and tears as she stated, "The Southern women have tried to evade the question of the color line time and again by giving some excuse or other every time it has been brought up. If the Illinois women do not take a stand now in this great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost." Wells Barnett reasoned black women's cause would be lost for 2 reasons. First, there was the contradiction of a march for equal suffrage rights that would relegate black women to a colored section in compliance with a system of inequality. Wells implicitly asked what was happening to the nation and to the overall movement for equal rights in various capacities of equal rights, if the hand of the Southern segregation could reach into the North and undermine the cause of democracy, even for Illinois. Second, Wells Barnett also knew that many black men and women were somewhat suspicious of women's suffrage. Wouldn't the addition of women, the majority of them white, to the electorate potentially double the opposition to black equality? Wouldn't Jim Crow segregation exclude black women voters from the electorate in most regions of the nation, just as it did black men? And if black women were allowed to vote, wouldn't that right compound black men's political emasculation? Indeed, the editors of the black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, predicted that if women get the vote in America, the colored race will suffer ills in legislation. Further ills, that is, in legislation. Black women would be lost because segregation aligned women's suffrage with white supremacy and further invalidated black women's right to citizenship. Nevertheless, Wells Barnett's statement of protest fell on deaf ears, and she appeared to capitulate to Grace Trout's demands. She declared she would not participate in the parade at all if she could not march with the Illinois delegation, and she left the practice hall. However, as the parade proceeded, Wells Barnett emerged from the crowd of spectators along the route, stepped into the marching line, and claimed her position among the Illinois delegation. In quiet commitment to the principle of equality the march should have upheld, she simply defied the segregation decree that had been communicated to her. Back in Chicago, over the course of the following 2 years, Wells Barnett succeeded in using the Alpha Suffrage Club to forward African American interests. The group joined with other black political organizations in Illinois to challenge 2 segregation bills and a set of anti-miscegenation bills that had been proposed. Wells Barnett helped organize a demonstration in which hundreds of black women converged on the state capitol building in Springfield and wound through its halls to protest this racist legislation. All of the bills were defeated. The Alpha Suffrage Club next succeeded in assisting the Illinois women's effort to extend their right to vote to full suffrage, and the organization subsequently helped elect Chicago's first black alderman in 1915.
Erin, thank you very much. This is fabulous. We're happy to end on an up note. I've always long thought that Ida B. Wells stepping off the curb and joining that delegation and marching is a role model for all of us. If it's important to you and you know it needs to be done, just get in there and do it. So, and I'm sorry that we couldn't hear more, but we did promise people that if you came, you would also get to ask questions of some of the panelists, and I suspect we have some questions in the audience, so we're going to stop for a moment. And let me say first, thanks to all of you. Loved the panel, your presentations. The slides were wonderful. It's been a great morning. And if we have time, we'll come back for a follow-up. But this is a moment to pause and see. And I see we don't have, oh, there are microphones down here. Oh, that's exciting. All right, please. Yes.
Hi, my name is, Roberta Francis, Bobby Francis. I really appreciate this panel. It was just wonderful at threading together so much information so succinctly, and especially the race, gender, intersex. I'm so glad we got to have clarification and additional information about that. I co-chair the Equal Rights Amendment Task Force for National Council of Women's Organizations. I'm from Alice Falls, New Jersey. I'm very interested in the history, including particularly that schism over the 15th Amendment. I just find it fascinating how race and gender have been played off against each other and integrally do have, sometimes conflicting interests in terms of choosing priorities. I've never felt it was a case of opposition in one category or the other, but just choosing priorities, as Douglas and Stanton, for example, had to do. And I'm bringing it up to date to just ask whether Alice Paul, this really links to her authoring the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923. I'm waiting for somebody to write the second half of Alice Paul's story around the Equal Rights Amendment. Do you have any comments about how, this is too big a question, but to work with that race-gender dynamic as we move forward on the agenda of equality, talk about mistakes and strategy and so on, just words of advice about dealing with it more productively?
I'm going to go back to Erin. This is a perfect way, since your race and gender, very much your specialty, you get the first answer.
Great. I think that the point I was trying to make in my talk is precisely that Sojourner Truth, I think, brilliantly presented us with an idea that in order to get around that conundrum, right, that split, which is really a false split, or should be, right, for an equal rights effort, that if you start from the positionality of black women, right, and to include class, we start with the positionality of poor black women or poor racialized women, Latina women, Asian women, right, and understand their positions and the various factors that come together to oppress them and alleviate those, or build a movement that works toward alleviating those. That's how everybody, right, all the racialized, right, all the sexualized and gendered people, oppressed by sex, gender, oppressed by race, right, class bias and labor problems, that's how those get relieved, right? Focusing on those people who are at the bottom, right, underneath all of that at once.
Okay, anyone else on the panel would like to answer the question?
Well, I just add to that I think the model of bringing everybody into the conversation is kind of an eternal one. Some of you may have read Nancy Cott's account of how the National Women's Party and Alice Paul was not interested in taking up the cause of black disenfranchisement after the 19th Amendment. She didn't see that. It wasn't really that she was against that in any way. It's simply that she didn't see it as her cause. So that was, I think, to some degree a failure of vision on her part, that she didn't see the inextricability of black women's situation and white women's situation. Hopefully, if she were still with us today, she would have learned from the last 50 years, perhaps, that we can actually work together on that expanded vision.
Thanks very much.
Ann Stone.
Ann Stone with the National Women's History Museum, one of the founding directors, and I have some comments first and then a question. There is a question coming. First, for those who did not attend our National Press Club panel, they made available coupons off for lunch at the National Press Club, great reduction. I have some that I can pass out to the first come, first serve. And today we do have a variety of events going on with our partner organizations as part of the Centennial. And I know that our carload is going to go after this, go to the White House, where the silent sentinels will be chained to the White House gate, and the National Park Service will be giving a talk about that participation in suffrage. After that, you could stop by the DAR, where they have a special exhibit having to do with the Centennial and fashion. The Smithsonian today has an exhibit on suffrage. The museum does as well. And Linda Denny, who as a museum board member was instrumental in helping pull together a lot of these events, is here. Linda, do you want to make yourself known? And I know she can provide even more information for our other partner organizations that have things going on all day. So there's no reason to leave DC today. You have a full day of activities having to do with this grand celebration. Now for my question. Well, actually, one other comment. I thought this panel was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. And you did us proud, and thank you. Everybody was great. You didn't duplicate. You really, you know, and Robert, I know you have another panel this afternoon, so if you want to hear more of Robert, you can go to that. And just terrific. Just a diversity of opinions, views, people, everything. And Anne, you did us proud. Thank you very much. Now for my question. So little is known of Alice Paul in our textbooks. So little is known of Ida B. Wells. Two incredible role models, as you said, stepping off the curb, doing what needs to be done, doing it differently, thinking differently about how to get things done. What if they hadn't existed? What would have happened to suffrage if there'd been no Alice Paul? Have any of you ever speculated on that?
I'm going to start then, and I'll ask everybody to think about that. First, the reason I believe in and so enjoy learning, studying, talking about women's history is that I don't believe we can know what women can do if we don't know what some women have already done. We have a fabulous history to build on. We don't always know what we're capable of because we don't know their history. I'll tell you, I believe if those particular women had not been there other women would have stepped forward. Maybe it would have been a different way. If Elizabeth Cady Stanton hadn't written the invitation to come to the church in Seneca Falls, I believe in the next few years, looking at the strains of reform, looking at what was happening within the abolition movement, where women who were speaking out on behalf of abolitionism were then told they had to sit back and be quiet because, they were women, that wasn't going to go on forever. Other women would also have stepped forward and say yes. So I do believe we were at a point in which humanity works so that as people learn what they can do, as they figure out what their rights are, as they look around, they're going to step forward and make it happen, maybe in slightly different ways. Alice Paul was a fabulous PR marketer, you're right. Maybe the next person who took wouldn't have been as good at PR, but might have done some other things even better. We would still be going forward.
Any speculation by any of the panelists as to who that person would have been?
Others?
Who those people would have been?
Oh dear, Mary's having trouble with, all right, we will do it this way. Mary's having trouble with hearing the question, so from now on, we will repeat the question. Anne's question was, we salute Alice Paul, we salute Ida B. Wells. If they had not been there at that particular point in time, then what? Is there an alternative history, if you will?
Well, speaking for Alice Paul, that amendment was going to pass sooner or later. But would it pass in time in 1920 for women to vote? I mean, Alice Paul was not the only one working for the amendment. The National American Women's Suffrage Association had a strong campaign in its state-by-state approach. And as they won states, which they did, 1917 was a big year. They won New York. They got more and more members of Congress who would have to support suffrage because they'd been elected by women. So it was going to happen, but it was possibly not going to happen quite so soon. But England had gotten the vote in 1914. Other countries were giving the vote. Canada had given women the vote. So even though Alice rallied the troops and perhaps got it sooner, she can't take all the credit.
Can I add something to that?
Of course.
This gives me a chance to mention a name that hasn't been mentioned often enough this weekend, and that's the name of Harriet Stanton Blatch. And I see Colleen Jenkins in the audience, her descendant. So we talk a little bit about Harriet Stanton Blatch. Alice Paul was not actually the heir apparent to national suffrage leadership. She sort of came out of the blue in many respects. Had she not had the courage, and she really wasn't someone who liked to be in the spotlight, she tried, before she asked the NASA to appoint her to the congressional committee from which she organized the parade, she went around and talked to Blatch and talked to other people in NASA about paying more attention to the federal amendment. They didn't think it was time, and it was only because she fervently believed it was time that she decided to step up and take that leadership. But the heir apparent, really, after Anna Howard Shaw, who was really not a very good administrator, she was going to fall at some point. But the heir apparent was really Harriet Stanton Blatch because of her pedigree. She was working in New York, was the first person to do parades in the country. She had also apprenticed with the Pankhursts to some degree. She was as much into politics as Alice Paul was. She was not the same kind of person, so it's unclear to me whether she would have done well at the national level, national leadership. But I think that she would have come to the fore in a stronger way at that point. And I suspect maybe Carrie Chapman Catt would have become leader of NASA before she did. Because there was a lot of dissension with Anna Howard Shaw. So things might have happened a little differently. I agree with Mary that it probably would have been delayed a couple years. But I think those two people we would have seen on the national scene a little bit earlier.
Great. Well, we have a lineup, I think, now of questions. So let's go.
Yes. My name is Suzanne Guazda. I have two quick questions, one about the past and one about the future. About the past, March 3rd of 1913, I was not aware that was the day before the presidential inauguration. What was their thinking in choosing that date? Did it have to do with the amount of attention and the press that were going to be in the city? And by way of connecting, our presidential inauguration parades now get so much attention. Why choose to have March 3rd for the 100th anniversary this year? You can probably quickly answer that. Secondly, the future. I'm a founding member of the National Women's History Museum, and I've been following the efforts for a long, long time. Can you just quickly, if you have time, bring us up to date on how close we're getting to having a museum somewhere on the mall that would be able to put up permanently some of these exhibits, these wonderful photographs about the March 3rd, 1913 suffragette march? Thanks.
Okay, I think the answer to the first question is until I would guess, 36, presidential inaugurations were in March. New presidents were inaugurated in March. We now think of it as January, but in fact, in those days, it was a March inauguration. And as I think Bob said in his presentation, with so many people in town, as we've heard Alice Paul, the marketer, figured, why not make your demonstration when you've already got your maximum audience? As the second one about the History Museum, I think I'm going to ask leaders of the museum to answer that, and we will put it aside for the moment. Let's hear from the questioners to the panel, and when we've done as many questioners as we can, I'm going to ask Joan in her wrap-up to tell us what's next for the museum. Deal? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So here's my question. I actually saw an exhibition about the 1913 suffrage parade in the Library of Congress. Lots of documents, probably many of which are in your book. And I was stunned. I had American history in high school and college, got a couple of paragraphs in history books, and then it was, the thing was, that's all that was said about it. I have been, since I found out about this event, talking to women everywhere I go. They don't know about the parade. My particular concern is that the young women don't know about the parade. So for example, when I said, hey, you guys, the Deltas marched in the parade, women of my age knew that, but my daughter didn't know that. So my question is, what can we, not just you all, we do to bring alive the courage of this founding movement to young women today? We are facing a redo from the 70s. What will we do to have this parade energize women in their teens and 20s and 30s? They've got the energy to take it on and drive it forward.
I'm going to delegate our youngest panelists to answer that. So Kristen and Erin, it's your closer to your generation that we've got the question about. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, repeat the question. How do we energize, reach young women who do not bluntly know this history? A question said she learned about Alice Paul and the march and was excited, but when she talks to other women and tries to get people to participate, they don't know about it.
I think it speaks to Ann Stone's point earlier as well about so much of the history being omitted from the textbooks. And I mean, quite frankly, part of what we can do is support the National Women's History Museum and other efforts to bring this gap in how we teach history to greater light. We need more people talking about it. I think that what inspires young people, inspires all people, is seeing, in history especially, is seeing their own stories, is being able to relate their lives to the lives of others. And the only way to do that is to tell stories of women struggling, overcoming, triumphing, to celebrate these stories. And the only way to do that is to put them out there.
Erin, do you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with your point. I also think that those stories that we tell need to be rich and full in the sense that, for example, the hard work that it takes to organize a major event like this, right, and to bring together all of these people, that I think when I teach movements of various kinds, a lot of students I come to understand don't really get that these things have to be built, right? It's not just that you say, oh, you know, I'm supportive of women's suffrage. Let's get together. Let's go to D.C. You know, you can do that. But in order to make it have the huge impact that is necessary to move things forward, you have to politic, you have to bring people together, you have to have them understand what it is that you want to have happen. You have to construct something and build it on purpose so that it's not something that just occurs, right? So a roadmap, sort of how people actually did this in the past, and therefore how, as they were inspired by the results and the actions and the words of these women in the past, how they can repeat those methods, right?
I see 4 questioners in the aisle. Here's what we'll do. We're going to take these 4 questions. We're going to try to be as quick as we can and precise in our answers. And then I'm going to ask Joan to come back up, tell us goodbye, and tell us what we're going to do next for the museum. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a student here. I was really struck by the descriptions of gendered, racist, patriarchal state violence against these nonviolent women suffragist activists, specifically the use of incarceration. And I think now, 100 years later today, women in the United States, specifically women of color, face the highest rate